Hey guys, it's me, cyoubx, and today we're going to be talking about why the GAN 356XS is a gimmick that you should be aware of. I actually wanted to make a video on how to set up my GAN 356XS initially, but as I was taking it apart and as I was looking at the mechanism, things started to frustrate me a little bit because it felt like things were really complicated for reasons that I was unaware of until I looked more closely at what was going on, and then I got frustrated because it was completely unnecessary. Before I go on a huge rant in this video, I just want to mention that I actually really like GAN cubes, and in fact the XS is a fantastic cube, and if world-class speed cubers are using it as their main, then it's good enough for me. In addition to that, I think GAN has really pushed the boundaries of cubing hardware over the years, and I haven't really always agreed with a lot of their engineering design and their engineering principles, but I'd be a fool to not admit that they've done a lot for the community, and I think it's really important to highlight that. That being said, all of the good that they've done and all of the work that they've put into this cube does not make them above constructive criticism, and that's what I want to talk about in this video. Let's just first talk about basic physics. When we refer to a cube and we think about how springy it is or what the tensions are for the cube, really what we're talking about is how much force the springs are exerting when we corner cut or do other things like that. The reason it's really important for speed cubing is because there's this trade-off between stability and how well a cube can corner cut. And depending on what setting you have, you might have a preference for more stability and therefore having less corner cutting, or you have a lot of corner cutting, but then you might have pieces that either lock up or explode. Now, in general, the force that's exerted by a spring can be characterized by Hooke's law, which effectively says that the force exerted by a spring is equivalent to the stiffness of the spring, or the spring constant K, multiplied by how much the spring is displaced, which is usually denoted by X. Now, in really old mechanisms and in classic designs with just a spring and a screw, you could accomplish a lot of different tensions by either swapping out the springs and therefore changing this stiffness constant K, or you could actually tension the cube by turning the screw, which effectively changes X, or the amount of displacement that you have. The more astute of you will already know where this video is going. So here we have the XS, the 356 XS, and it comes with a single set of springs. So before we even go into the tensioning shenanigans that this cube has, GAN has already decided that everyone who buys this cube wants the same spring constant or the same stiffness of springs. And that's more or less okay. For me, I actually like the stiffness of the springs, but I could see some people already having problems with this because they want something that's either stiffer or looser. But of course, you could also change how much force the spring has, or the springiness of the cube, by changing the displacement X. And that's basically what this cube tries to do. So on the screen right now, I'm showing a really rough diagram of the tensioning mechanism. The black T that you see is the core arm, the blue thing is the tensioning nut, and the white rectangles are the two parts of the spring. So you can think of the separation between the two white boxes as how stretched or how compressed the spring is. And so there are sort of two things at play here. The position of the blue nut relative to the core arm, and the position of the top of the spring relative to the top of the blue nut. Keep in mind that in all of these scenarios, the bottom of the spring is in the same spot, which is at the bottom of the centerpiece. So first, let's just take a scenario where the spring is on the highest ratchet. If we change the tension nut between the four choices, we're changing effectively how compressed the spring is. So if we then turn the spring to engage the ratchet mechanism, we're still changing how compressed the spring is. And so what that means is that we have two mechanisms that do the same thing. They both affect the springiness of the cube by changing the displacement X. So why is this necessary? And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, cyoubx, you idiot. It's because it gives you more possibilities, more combinations of tensions. And kind of, but if you use your noggins for a second, you'll notice that there's a huge flaw in this logic. There are 4 tension nut settings and 6 ratchet settings for each of those tension nut settings, which means that there are 24 total combinations for tensioning this cube. And that's pretty good. But guess how many tensioning possibilities you have on a standard screw and spring mechanism from, say, a 2005 Rubik's DIY? Infinite. You can turn a screw as much or as little as you want, and you can even swap the springs. So you have way more possibilities for tensioning a standard cube than you do on this $60 cube. So effectively what GAN has done here is they've reinvented a screw, and they've charged $30-some extra for it. And I think the thing that makes this really frustrating for me as an engineer is that it's not even a better screw. It's a screw that has 24 settings. Just let that sink in for a moment. Granted, the settings that they give you are very precise. You can very easily replicate the same tensions on all sides, and that's sort of the point of this system. But you could do the same thing by just putting a little marker on the head of a screw so that you know how much you've turned. For a little bit of background, I've actually worked with surgical equipment as part of my PhD, especially for brain surgeries. So you can imagine that those kinds of devices require immense precision. And by and large, the way that you get really precise measurements and precise movements of anything that you do in the surgical room is actually just with a screw with a very, very fine pitch. Because if you have a really well-defined pitch for a screw, you can actually move various distances with really, really great precision. So why is all of this necessary for this XS cube then? The GAN 356XS is expensive partially because of manufacturing costs and partially because of research and design. That's a given. The problem is that they made poor design choices, which led to inflated manufacturing costs, and now consumers are the ones paying for that inflated price. If you follow this channel for a while, you'll know that I actually like GAN cubes quite a lot, and I've used them as a main since 2015 or something. My main before this cube, I don't know if this is my main yet, but the one that I used extensively was the GAN Air SM. And I didn't really like the implementation of the GES nuts in that cube either, but at least that system made sense. You had different choices of springs, which affects the K constant in Hooke's law, of course, and then you could also tension the nuts such that you change the displacement X. Here, in this XS, first of all, they've already decided which spring you're going to use. You don't really have a choice when you buy a $60 cube. You have one set of springs. And they only let you have 24 tensioning possibilities. That's pretty ridiculous. It goes beyond that because even the implementation of those 24 settings is not really that great. Let's say you go with setting 2, which is on the dark blue nut, and you think that you might want it looser. What you have to do now is you actually have to swap from the dark blue nut to a light blue nut and go to setting 3. Let's say you try it and you decide that, oh, actually I kind of like 2 better. You now have to swap that tensioning nut back to the original one and go to setting 2. And I realize that that doesn't really take that much time. But you know what takes less time? Turning a screw head. The other thing that I have a lot of trouble with this cube and this mechanism is that there are no values that are explicitly stated anywhere in the documentation that I could see. And because I don't know the displacement values, I don't know if setting 2 on ratchet 4 is really any different than setting 1 on ratchet 3. I get that this cube is about being precise with your tensioning, but I just want to make a claim here that precision really doesn't matter if you don't have a target. Anyway, I think you guys get the point that I'm trying to make here. The cube is good, and it's quite possibly going to be my main. But for me, it's so disgustingly over-engineered, and consumers are the ones paying for it, and I don't think that's fair. I realize that there are cheaper GAN cubes now, but the problem and the concern that I have is that this cube should have been one of those cheaper ones. Again, just to reiterate, I like the cube, and I like GAN's intentions of pushing the boundaries of cubing hardware, and I think it's super admirable. I just think there are better ways to do it than inventing kind of a bad screw and charging $60 for it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Until next time, toodles.